Hi, welcome back for another Anatomy of a Pose. Today we are talking about Virabhadrasana 1, or most commonly known as Warrior 1. Warrior 1 is one of the shapes that I get asked about a lot as a yoga teacher because there's a lot of complex action that's happening here at the hips. And depending on the mobility that we have at the hips is going to influence here what happens through the rest of the spine and vice versa. So we're going to kind of dissect some of those actions with a lot of focus today, mostly on what's going on from the waist down, in order to build security and stability from the ground up is going to make the difference, and very much what this is about. So Warrior 1 has this energetic presence of a strong warrior shape, right? And warriors are primed to take ourselves into battle, right? So in order to do that, we have to have really strong stability action or stable action in our lower body. So we're going to first start talking about the position of which the legs go in. Now, what I want to start with is that our leg, where our leg goes into our pelvis, is known as our hip joint. So our leg can flex, it can extend. Okay, if we come back to neutral, it goes out away from the body called abduction and back in towards the middle called adduction. So one's abduction and adduction is the other. Again, there's no quiz here. There's no anatomy quiz, so it's okay. You don't need to know those terms. But if you hear teachers talking about it at all, then you have some of that language about what it's about. The other really, really important shape that I want to talk about with your leg today is external rotation, which means the hip or the thigh bone, the femur bone, is rotating outward away from the center, and internal rotation, which means the femur bone is rotating inward towards the middle. Okay, so those are going to be the big ones that I want to talk about with you today. So if we started here in a shape where our legs are a little bit further apart, and if I just played with what the idea is like to just externally rotate one leg and internally rotate the other, it can give us a lot of information about what's going on with our pelvis and what's going on in our hip sockets. So if I start here with my left leg, if I lift up my toes and I pivot on my heel, my pelvis doesn't move, I'm just externally rotating at my leg. And if I take a peek down, my toes aren't quite where they would be facing forward. In order to do that, something else has got to compensate for that without me moving my pelvis at this point. So I'm just going to then turn that back in and just stay curious about the external rotation in my hips. Now this hip is very different, and automatically what oftentimes happens for people is that they do this. And you notice then when I take my pelvis out of neutral and I shift it, now any action that's going to happen in my low back is going to be different. And that's where a lot of people get into trouble there, is that they feel this shape in Warrior 1, they might feel a lot of compression or discomfort in their low back. And these are some of the reasons why. So if we go back to that front leg, and if I externally rotate, again, now what we're going to do is I'm going to internally rotate my back leg. So I kicked my back heel out, and now I've got that so I've got external rotation in my front leg, but my back leg is an internal rotation. So you can see here then my hip bones are staying more in that level space for now. Okay, and we're going to come back. We're going to feel out what that's like on the other side. Just kind of getting familiar with the directions here of the shapes that we're talking about. And it also can be really interesting. I'm going to kick up my back heel, so now my back leg is a more internal rotation. And just feel out what that's like for one leg to externally rotate and one leg to internally rotate. I'm going to lift my toes, pivot back in my heel. So in Warrior 1, we are imagining that the hip bones, and we want to keep our pelvis level so that what's going on through my spine is length. And there's some extension of the spine, but it's not much. And for most of us and most practitioners of yoga, what we're working with is keeping as much length in the spine as we can. So again, what's happening downstairs is going to have an impact on what's going on upstairs. So with the intention of imagining that we're wanting to square the hips or keep the pelvis level, but that the hip bones and the belly are going to be facing in the same direction. So oftentimes what can happen, and it's not uncommon, again, it comes from where different lineages of yoga or yoga practices come from, is the position of the back foot. And I want to talk a little bit about that before I change directions here. So if I then pivot and I externally rotate my front hip, you can see there my hip hikes just a little bit, so I'm going to come back. And then when I then plant that foot, I'm going to take that back foot out about 45 degrees. So here again, you can see if my hands are at my hip bones, that my pelvis is mostly level. So if I internally rotate here, and my foot is set back at that 45 degrees, and then I spin my belly to the front, all of this action in the back leg is being driven from my glute, my hamstring, and then the pinky toe side of my back foot to anchor down through my heel. To anchor down through the back side of my heel, there's an action here that's happening from the knee down on the outside of your lower leg. That muscle, so it's different than the muscle of the shin, which we talked a little bit about last time when we talked about downward facing dog, but this is a little bit more of the lateral line of the body. So if you reach down through your back heel and your back hip then steers forward, your back hip or your front leg has a little bit of slight external rotation, then that allows this back hip then to draw forward, squaring our hips here. And already there's so much work. And I haven't even bent that front leg yet, okay? And then notice that sometimes what happens with the spine is this, okay? Where the ribs are gonna flare out and then we take this action in the low back. And we don't want that. We wanna continue this length here by activating, drawing in some in the front body and putting a ton of work into what's happening in that back leg so that our back heel stays anchored. Now, one of the differences that can happen with different practitioners, I started to hint at this, is that they'll cue that the back foot is more at a 40 or more of a 90-degree angle. So more in that shape there. Now, where that can get problematic, and I don't think that there's one right way or one wrong way. I think that one of the things that I love about this conversation we keep having is why? Like, what is it that you feel, and why is it that I would practice one way or practice it a different way? What makes the most sense in my body? Now, if my back foot is at a 90-degree angle, and the intention is to square the hips so that it's there in the direction that the belly button is going, so our trunk is going forward, my hips are shaping forward, where's the torque going to be on the back leg? At the knee joint. So just for a moment, if I then take and I kick that back heel out, look at all the space I now have to take my front hip or my back hip forward. What's the difference there? If I'm pivoting here, right, it's different than if I have a heel, if I'm at a different angle. So now my back foot's at a 45-degree angle, and now I've got this space. And so for many people, keeping that out of the knees is going to be a really, really, really helpful practice so that your hips stay happy, your knees stay happy, and therefore the rest of your spine stays happy. Because as we find ourselves in any of these shapes, again, we want to find this balance between effort and ease. Where is it that the effort in the lower body here as it anchors and finds stability and again strength and power, so that we can find freedom and ease in the breath in order to take on what's going to come at us. So let's take this shape now. I'm going to square us to the square here forward. So again, you can take another look at the pelvis and also just a different transition. So if I start with Tadasana and I lift up one foot, again, already notice if the pelvis does stuff like that. So that if I then hinge back and I reach my foot back and I land there more of a crescent warrior, now spin my back heel down. Again, I'm going to show you today how keeping it more of a 45-degree angle. Personally, with most of the clients that I've worked with most of the students that I work with, that angle serves the action in their back leg much more and oftentimes keeps their back knee much, much happier. And the second bonus to that is, again, if the intention there is reaching down through the back heel, extending through your leg, the hamstring is lengthening, your glute is working, and then action in the lateral line of the body, and this spiraling forward there of your back leg, and there's your internal rotation in order to keep the pelvis happy. So let's talk about the front leg. Here you can see my heel, and here's where you have options. You can have a wider stance. That is okay. It is also an option to have more of a heel to arch alignment. The more narrow your stance is here, the more challenging it's going to be. The wider your stance is, as far as width goes, the more supportive it can be. The other shape that you can change with this is how far back your back leg is behind you. There's going to be another. The shorter the stance is between your 2 feet, the more stabilizing and the more accessible it can be. There's also versions where that shape is a little bit longer. It requires a lot more flexion in the back ankle, and some action in the hips is also going to be a little bit different. So if we started with the front leg long, anchoring down through the back leg, again, feeling the energy down through your back heel, almost thinking energetically bowl to heel, and feel how you liven up here through your quadricep, but not locking out your knee. And so then when you're wrapping the back hip here in internal rotation, you might feel some action there, again, in your glute muscles, not only just in the back. The longer your stance is, you might start to feel this even in your glute medius, which is more of the muscle that's going to be a little bit more to the outside of your butt cheek. Your glute maximus is your largest of your glute muscles. More of its action is to extend your back leg. So again, that variation in the stance, you might feel that slightly different in what your hips are doing. So now, if I draw that energy with my back hip internally rotating, my front leg now is in a slight external rotation. What we have to watch out for here is if I over externally rotate, I lose the connection of the ball mound of my big toe, and then I can put some strain in my front knee. So there's just a slight bit of external rotation here at our hip. But remember, I also talked about the shape of adduction, drawing into our center. Now imagine that with your 2 legs. Feel the energy when we adduct the legs, draw them in a little bit. It's going to keep me from over-rotating in my front knee so it doesn't pop out to the side. But also, it draws some energy between our 2 heels. So now, if I bend into my front knee, drawing the knee so that it's reaching towards the direction of our front ankle, but again, it doesn't actually ever have to stack. If it does, wonderful. If it doesn't, your intention is more about keeping the levelness of your pelvis, and then what happens here, the energetics are going to take you there. Now, this is a great amount of effort that's going into the legs here. This is very much about stamina and building endurance and strength in the legs. So again, you want to watch out for this. There is an over external rotation of your hip. Again, activating your adductors on the inside of your leg, in the space here between your knee to your pubic bone. If I draw in a little adduction, but I still have the intention of external rotation, right? A little outward, there's the balance. Okay? Same idea if I'm more in heel to arch alignment. Pelvis didn't move. There's still a little bit of adduction, not as great as there is if my feet are apart, but the adductors here are going to balance here what's going on in my external rotators so that when I bend in, you'll feel a little hamstring action and strengthening there. Okay, I'm gonna release my back heel, step to the top, because oh my goodness, that might be the longest warrior 1 shape I've ever done in my legs. So, let's talk about, now that we have an idea of what's going on in our legs, let's talk about what's going on in the upper body here. So again, I'm going to start from Tadasana. I'm going to step this foot back. I'm going to ground down my back heel. So again, I'm just spinning it down, feeling how my glute reaches and extends my back leg. Again, feeling here how my back hip, and sometimes again, extending the front leg can help you square your pelvis there and keep it a little more stable. So that when I anchor down through my back leg, bend into my front knee, My back glute is firing to lengthen and extend here in my back leg. I can feel this on the outside edge of my back leg from my knee down to my ankle. And that's really common space. And I know we're going to talk about the upper body here in a second. But what you want to think about is if you can lift up just a little bit in the inside of your back arch, the pinky toe side is really anchored here in my back foot. And then feel here that space on the outside edge of your back foot here, or your back leg, from your knee to your ankle. Okay? So if everything's squared and happy here, here's focus number 1. Now, what we have to think about so that we don't overextend the spine, or again, like flare out through our ribs, is oftentimes what happens, is if you imagine the muscle group from your rib cage down to your pubic bone. Imagine like where the 6-pack muscles are. That's your rectus abdominis. It's not flexing a lot here. It is still lengthening, but it's co-contracting with the extensors of your spine to keep you more vertical. A little bit of activation here is also going to keep you from, again, going into extension because they flex your spine. Okay, so we've got some action there. Also, because of the shape of the legs, there's a little bit of, and if you take your hands, you can feel here your transverse abdominis is supporting you, and there's a little bit of action there. But also the shape, in order to rotate the spine forward, to take the belly button forward, you have your side core muscles here, your obliques, that are most commonly associated with side bending and also rotation because of the side flexion there, or what we call lateral flexion in anatomy terms. So in order to rotate the spine, you can feel here how the outside of the abdomen, as it wraps in to draw my belly button here forward. And then that means this side is drawing back. Okay? Now, if we think about that shape that we were in downward facing dog last week, what we were talking about, when we reach the arms up overhead, we want the shoulder bone here, the arm bone, your humerus, and external rotation. So take your palms up or face them forward. And then when I then elevate up, remember how the shoulder blade glides up the back of the backside of your rib cage? Because your arms are up of your head, your shoulder blades naturally glide up your spine. Now you're not crouching up towards your ears, but there is a natural elevation. So the serratus anterior is absolutely involved, and because, if you remember from last time, how the serratus anterior comes from your shoulder blade. I'm going to step forward here and come out of that shape for a while in my legs. From the inside of my shoulder blade, wraps into my rib cage. In order to keep my rib cage from flaring open, also has an involvement, not only in lifting my arms, but also keeping me engaged here in the core muscle that manages our shoulder blades in relation to our rib cage. Okay, so let's take that to the side for another moment. Again, setting up that space, and I want you to tuck in my shirt so you can see what's going on here. So again, if I take some intention of squaring my hips, extension through the spine, but you can see there's some spinal extension that's going to show up there. So if I anchor down my back foot, bend into my front knee, what we want to watch out for is dumping in the low back or pitching ourselves way far forward. So sometimes what needs to happen is we need to take out some of the bend in the front leg in order to work with the extension of the spine as you reach up through the crown of your head. But again, all of that work of reaching down from the bottom half, allowing the elevation and the lift up, again, remembering the arms in an external rotation, but your hands can always come down to your heart or in a goalpost shape. But having them in a goalpost shape is nice if your arms are not up over your head because of the involvement to draw some attention into the serratus anterior to rein things in from your shoulder blade to your rib cage. And release the back heel and then step forward. So what I want you to take away from this shape is that what's going on from your hips or your pelvis down is going to take or have a large amount of emphasis here on what's going on throughout the rest of your spine. in order for the energy to move through our spine so that we have freedom in our breath, we have to first honor what it is that we need from our hips down. So if I have any limitation here in my pelvis, taking those adjustments by either shortening your stance or giving a little bit more space, width-wise too, allows you to have a little bit more freedom to draw intention from your waist down so that we can then have the ease and allow the body to expand. So as you add and you build on and you play with these shapes, always watching how you respond into this space here in your center, because that's going to give you all the information that you need. The other place that, again, the most common things and concerns that come up about that shape is what's going on in the knees. Remembering that spiral action of your back foot, that internal rotation, the wrapping inward of your thigh as you reach down through the back edge of your heel. So it's kind of like that double spiral shape that we talked about in upward or in downward facing dog last week in the shoulder. How when the shoulder bone externally rotates, but we're pronating or rotating inward from the forearm down. A lot of that similarity or the similar energetic actions are happening in your back leg, right? Except closer to your pelvis here or your center. This here is internally rotating. There's a little bit of wrapping out and down into the outside edge of your back foot. Playing with the alignment of not only how far away your feet are, but also the angle of your back foot. And listen to what your knee has to say about this. Keeping happy knees and happy hips in all of the shapes that we take in this practice is going to help us stay healthy in our body, move intelligently, and hopefully then keeps us practicing for years and years and years. Reach out if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to help kind of break down or brainstorm anything that comes up for you. So take care, be well, and we'll see you soon.